Numbers. We came into the book of Numbers with some hope, and yet we have seen Israel fail in an absolutely epic way as we've worked our way through Numbers 1 through 21, and we've come to the point where we realize more than ever probably that Israel's only hope is God. And one of the most graphic examples of God's faithfulness to his stubborn and rebellion people comes in Numbers chapter 22 through 24. In his book, Dominion and Dynasty, really one of the best books of biblical theology you can get. You could even just stop this video, go to Amazon, buy it. Great book. Stephen Dempster sets the scene. He writes, when Israel's on the march, they encounter a formidable obstacle. At the border of Canaan, Balak, the Moabite king, realizes that Israel seems invincible. So he hires Balaam to use his supernatural powers, not just to thwart Israel, but to curse it into oblivion. So this is an attack on God's promised plan. The king of Moab says something about Balaam in Numbers 22:6 that brings to mind something God once said about Abraham, actually. What is it? He writes, come now, curse this people for me, since they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them from the land, for I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed. The king of Moab is saying that about Balaam, and it is almost like a challenge is being set between Balaam and God, isn't it? Who will win? In verses 7 through 14, the princes of Moab go to Balaam with money to purchase a curse, but Balaam rejects their offer because God tells him in verse 12, you shall not go with them, you shall not curse the people, for they are blessed. Balak then sends another delegation to Balaam, more in number. This time God allows Balaam to go, perhaps because of Balaam's hard-heartedness. But God puts an obstacle in his way to teach him a lesson. If you look at Numbers 22 through 35, it's a pretty funny story, but it teaches a pretty important lesson at the same time. The renowned prophet Balaam has less spiritual insight than a donkey. You remember how the donkey sees the angel that wants to kill them, and Balaam gets so angry because he can't see the angel and he wants the donkey to keep going, and finally the donkey talks to him and says, what basically are you doing? Come on. Now, Balaam is a complicated figure, honestly. What do we know about him from the text? If you look at Numbers 22, 23, he's a prophet of some sort, pretty famous. He says Yahweh speaks for him. He actually says, he tries to make a big deal of this, the word that God puts in my mouth is all I can speak. He's very clear about that, says that a number of times. That sounds good. But if you look at Joshua, he was actually known as someone who practices divination, which is a curse. And he ends up being the one in Numbers that sends in or counsels the king of Balak to send in women to seduce the Israelites because none of his curses work. So what's going on? You know, some parts of Balaam seem okay, some parts seem terrible. It could be that Balaam at some point was a convert to Yahweh, but like Simon Magus in the New Testament was really only using Yahweh for his own ends and later abandons him and joins the fight against the followers of Yahweh. But whatever the case with Balaam, the point of the whole story is that God is faithful to his promise. According to Numbers 23, 1 through 11, what happens the first time Balaam goes to curse Israel? He blesses them. And why does it happen this way? According to Numbers 23, 8 through 10, Balaam says it. How can I curse whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? The second time Balaam tries, you can see what happens in verses 18 through 26. And listen especially to verse 21. He says, I have to bless them because God is in their midst. And then he says, the shout of a king is among them. God is their king. And that's really one of the whole points of the book of Numbers, actually, is that in Leviticus, holiness is defined. In Numbers, holiness is demonstrated. What God's wanting to do with Israel is demonstrate his holiness, demonstrate his greatness to the world. You remember, Israel was supposed to be a sign to the world of what it looked like to have God as their king. And that's even why they had their camp set up the way they did with God at the center. That's how an ancient king would set up his camp as he goes to war. And so the whole world was supposed to be looking on and seeing this is what it's like when God is king. And that's part of what makes Israel's sin such a big deal and their failure to believe God such a big deal. Now, Balaam keeps trying, and Balak keeps trying by asking Balaam to keep trying. And if you look at Numbers 24, 5 through 9, listen to this and tell me what stands out to you here. He says, "How lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your encampments, O Israel, like palm groves that stretch afar, like gardens beside a river, like aloes that the Lord has planted, like cedar trees beside the waters. Waters shall flow from his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters. His king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. God brings him out of Egypt, and is for him like the horns of the wild ox. He shall eat up the nations, his adversaries, and shall break their bones in pieces, and pierce them through with his arrows. He crouched, he lay down like a lion, and like a lioness. Who will rouse him up? Blessed are those who bless you, and cursed are those who curse you." And this is such an important passage, actually. It draws from Eden imagery and Exodus imagery as well. Stephen Dempster again writes, "Israel is compared to rivers and gardens, trees that the Lord has planted. The Israelite tents are like the trees planted by Yahweh." This was the divine intention when Israel was brought out from Egypt. It was to be planted in God's mountain, that is, to be returned to Eden. Then the image switches to that of the abundance of water that flows from the garden. Next, there is a beautiful image. His seed is by many waters. In the context, this suggests that his seed is planted by the many waters of the garden, perhaps referring to another tree, which also refers to Israel. To confirm this double meaning, the image abruptly shifts to the exaltation of an Israelite king over Agag. This seed refers to one of the trees, which will become higher than a future Amalekite king, a symbol of evil thwarting the purposes of God, since the Amalekites ambushed the Israelites after their Exodus salvation. Thus, Balaam looks forward to the last days when an Israelite seed will become a king more exalted than one of their greatest enemies. His prophecy then concludes by citing two passages from the book of Genesis. The first one quotes Genesis 49:9, virtually word for word, which prophesies world rule for Judah in the last days. Israel's like a mighty lion which will crush his enemies. The second passage reaffirms the Abrahamic promise. May those who bless you be blessed, and those who curse you be cursed. An exasperated King Balak finally orders Balaam to go. What else are you going to do when he comes and you ask him to curse, and he actually says God's going to raise up a king from this nation that's going to defeat all the other kings and their kingdom's going to be established. But before he does go, Balaam leaves the Moabite king with a parting shot, a prediction of what will transpire for Israel in the latter days, 24:14. It's interesting that God uses this pagan prophet to make one of the most important prophecies in the Pentateuch. He says, "A star will come out of Jacob, and a scepter will rise from Israel, crushing the foreheads of Moab and the skulls of the sons of Sheth." This prophecy places Israel's hope in a future ruler who will crush the skulls of his enemies. Viewed in its immediate context, the prophecy seems insignificant. Israel will finally triumph over all its enemies sometime in the future. When the context is expanded, however, and this is still Stephen Dempster, more details are seen. The last time a prophecy was made in which the expression "the latter days" occurred was Jacob's blessing to his sons. In that blessing, the tribe of Judah was singled out as the one that would have the strength of a lion and whose universal rule would transform nature. This later blessing of Balaam is a direct response to the blessing of Jacob. It mentions that a star shall rise out of Jacob, a scepter from Israel. Is the star another reference to rule, or could it mean something else? Could it mean an individual star from a huge mass of stars? The first reference to stars signifying descendants is Genesis 15:5, when Abraham is promised a seed as numerous as the stars in the sky. Later, he's promised that he'll have kings as descendants. This star may be a reference to one individual descendant from the group. More to the point is the analogy of the serpent's defeat at the hands of the seed of the woman in Genesis 3:15. A battle is envisioned that results in a crushing blow to the serpent's head by the seed of the woman. Near the end of the narrative section of the Torah, there's a promise that this will happen at the end of days. The star will smash the heads of the Moabites, who here represent the forces arraigned against God's people, forces that seek to curse it and thwart the promise of God. The wider literary context contains a direct allusion to a particular seed of the woman, which is going to be part of the larger seed of Israel that is going to defeat the forces of evil and provide rule for the world. The geographical domain is not only Israel, but probably also the world. In summary, then, the Balaam prophecies envision a king emerging from Israel to destroy its enemies. In language identical to the blessing of Judah in Genesis 49, he's like an invincible lion. Similarly, in the next oracle of Balaam, a star and a scepter arise from Israel to smash the heads of the Moabites, who represent the enemy of Israel. What a promise. What a promise. You come after God's people, you end up experiencing judgment. And God's got a plan. The plan is on track, no matter how chaotic his people might seem at this point. In spite of God's faithfulness to his promise, which is our only hope, Israel completely disregards God in Numbers 25. Balak recognizes he's not going to be able to stop Israel this way. So he has to he's not going to get Yahweh to give up on Israel. So he has to get Israel to give up on Yahweh. That's basically his strategy. Moabite women invite the Israelite men to sacrifice to Baal, whom the Canaanites believed was the god of fertility. It's ironic that Moabite women got Israelite men to forsake their God for idols, because in Ruth we're going to find the opposite, a Moabite woman who forsakes her idols for the one true God. But here, what these women were calling on the Israelite men to do was a very wicked practice. One author writes, Baal and his bloodthirsty wife, Anat, variously identified with Asherah, was venerated by means of the most sensuous, orgiastic practices known to humanity. And Israel's rebellion at this point is so complete that in verse 6 we see that a man actually brings a Midianite woman to his family in the sight of Moses and the entire congregation, in spite of the judgment that God had just executed on Israel for their idolatry. At this point, Phinehas stands up for God, and he executes the Israelite man and this woman. And God explains what Phinehas was doing in verse 11. Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the people of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not consume the people of Israel in my jealousy. Now, Phinehas is actually a pretty interesting character. The name Phinehas is an Egyptian loanword, and the Egyptians referred to the Cushites as Neshu. The article ph in Egyptian, when attached to a word, basically meant the. Therefore, his name translates the Cushite. One scholar suggests this was common. This was a common Egyptian name which connotes either a person with unusually dark skin or a true African. Cushites were the African people in the Old Testament. Now, Phinehas was a grandson of Aaron. One of Aaron's sons, we're assuming here, must have married an Egyptian, and Phinehas plays an important role here. He is the one who stops Israel from sliding into apostasy. That's usually Moses' role. God commends Phinehas. Later in Numbers, Phinehas will lead the military battle that destroys the Midianites. Phinehas also will appear in Joshua 22, where he'll help the tribes of Israel resolve a potentially devastating misunderstanding. In the book of Joshua, he's the only leader besides Joshua to take any initiative in resolving a problem. When the psalmist talks about Phinehas in Psalm 106, he speaks of him in a very positive light. Phinehas stood up and intervened, and the plague was checked. This was credited to him as righteousness for endless generations to come. That's Psalm 106, 28 to 31. Daniel Hayes, he comments on Phinehas. He says, thus we see that Phinehas plays an important role not only in the Torah, but in other texts as well. Does the meaning of his name carry a significance within the context of the role that he plays? How does the son of Eleazar, the high priest, end up with a name that means the Cushite or the Negro? Keep in mind that the Egyptian word from which Phinehas derives does not just mean dark-skinned, but is rather an explicit reference to the ethnic inhabitants of Cush. Therefore, since Numbers 12 states twice that Moses' wife is from Cush, it's suggestive that at least another relative with a name refers to the inhabitants of Cush and might be connected in some way. Phinehas is the great nephew of Moses. The family is also a priestly family. Perhaps Moses' marriage to the Cushite woman also united her family to his, resulting in other intermarriages between the two families. Phinehas might very well have had a Cushite mother, and therefore might have looked like a Cushite at birth, thus receiving this name, the Cushite. This is as plausible an explanation as any other. While the meaning of Phinehas' name is absolutely clear, the significance of this meaning is admittedly not quite as certain. However, I would propose several theological conclusions. This is Daniel Hayes. He says, first of all, it is extremely probable that Phinehas was at least half black. When combined with the mixed multitude of Exodus 12 and the Cushite wife of Moses, Phinehas reveals to us that there was a significant presence of Cushites among the early Israelites. These Cushites were clearly black Africans by the modern definition of the term. The stories of Phinehas show that at least one of these people related to black Africa was tightly incorporated into the leadership of Israel. Indeed, at the beginning, the highest level of Israelite priesthood apparently had black ethnic elements within it. But again, back to our story, we're seeing that in spite of Israel's continued failure, God proves himself faithful to the promise he made to Abraham. And in Numbers 26 through 36, he prepares a new generation for entrance into the land of Canaan, which is why in chapter 26 we get another census. But this time it's of a new generation who God promised to enable to enter the promised land. Now, if you look at these two censuses, or censi, I don't know which it is, you discover the desert wandering resulted in a net loss of 820 men of military age. It's somewhat surprising that all of Israel died in the wilderness by this point. It had been 38 years. Some of the men were 20 when the census was taken. So this means they died by the time they were 58, which seems young, but it shows that the wilderness time was difficult for Israel and that God judged their sin by not granting many of them long lives. The death rate was high. And yet, with all these men dying, here's what's surprising, especially surprising, their children were taken care of. And the number of men in Israel in Numbers 26 is basically the same as it was before. So this shows God's grace if you think about it. When you have a short life expectancy for adults, or when you have a short life expectancy somewhere in a nation, it's usually because a lot of children are dying. But here it's the opposite. It's mostly adults who are dying as a result of God's judgment. Because the older generation has died out and even Moses himself is going to die, God has to appoint a new leader for Israel. He has to tell the people how to live and what to do in chapters 27 through 30. And then in chapters 31 and 32, we see the people winning battles. In chapter 33, we find Moses recounting the wanderings of Israel, which leads us to the end of the chapter where God reaffirms his commitment to giving the people rest in the promised land. And the final chapter of Numbers points to a hopeful future for the people of Israel as Moses describes where the people would live once they enter the land, recognizes new leaders for the people when they enter the land, how to treat the Levites, how to deal with people who have killed someone, and then rules on how women can inherit land in chapter 36, which seems like a strange little story to us, but it's actually a pretty powerful story because you remember the first generation, they didn't want to enter the land. They were so scared, but now these women, they come to Moses. They're so sure God's going to keep his promise. This second generation of women, they're so sure God's going to keep his promise. What they're worried about is, hey, how are we going to be able to inherit the land? Because we're women and we don't have male relatives. Though, you know, reading this, in a sense, it feels fairly undramatic, but as Paul House has pointed out, clearly the book's last few chapters are pointing to a more hopeful future. That's the point. Israel can expect to approach Canaan again. God hasn't given up on his people. In fact, at the end of Numbers, they are really close to the land. Horrible things have happened in the past, but a new era is dawning. Numbers has delayed the fulfillment of the promise of the giving of the land, not because of God's failure, but because of his people's failure to believe. Numbers says, what does God want? He wants you to believe that he can keep his promise. But in the end, even his people's failure is not going to stop God from keeping his promise. God's word, Numbers shouts out, God's word will come true. The plan is still on track. That is good news.